In early 1943, Japanese naval intelligence received the Hellcat's specifications. The aircraft weighed 12,186 pounds loaded. The Zero weighed 5,800. Captain Minoru Genda, the man who planned Pearl Harbor, reviewed the numbers at Combined Fleet Headquarters and reached a logical conclusion. The Americans had either built a catastrophic mistake or the data was deliberate disinformation. No rational design philosophy produces a fighter this heavy. His written assessment, preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, categorized the specifications as probable Allied deception. The archival record shows what followed: 5,223 aircraft destroyed, 270 lost, a 19-to-1 kill ratio. We examine the primary sources, the logistics, and the technical record to understand exactly how that happened. To understand why Genda's dismissal made sense, we have to look at what the Zero actually was. The Mitsubishi A6M was built around a single engineering principle: sacrifice everything that does not produce performance. The airframe used extra superduralumin, a classified aluminum alloy that created a structure roughly 30% lighter than comparable American designs. There was no armor plate protecting the pilot. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks. The radio was frequently removed entirely. Every component that added weight without adding speed or maneuverability was eliminated. The result was a wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot and a turning radius of 612 feet. That number was not just a performance figure. It was the foundation of an entire combat doctrine. Japanese fighter tactics were built around the assumption that their aircraft could always outturn whatever they encountered. Get inside the enemy's turn, hold position, fire. The Zero's maneuverability made that approach nearly automatic. The early war record validated this completely. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese lost 29 aircraft and destroyed 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed. Over Darwin, 2 losses against 30. The British Far East Fleet's air arm was effectively eliminated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force ceased to exist within days. These were not marginal victories. They were systematic annihilations, and the Zero was at the center of all of them. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would accumulate 87 claimed kills and become Japan's ace of aces, described the Zero in his recovered diary. "American planes fly like trucks," he wrote. "Powerful but clumsy. They build fighters like they build cars, heavy, overbuilt, wasteful." This was not arrogance without foundation. This was a pilot accurately describing what he had observed across hundreds of combat hours. When American engineers tested a captured Zero in 1942, they initially rejected their own performance figures as impossible. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the turn radius of a biplane, and the firepower to destroy anything it caught. Air test data confirmed what the Japanese already knew. The Zero was a genuine engineering achievement. Now this is where the archival record becomes important. The Japanese confidence in September 1943 was not a cultural failure of humility. It was mathematically grounded. 2 years of primary source data, action reports, kill ratios, pilot testimony, all pointed in the same direction. The Zero was dominant. The doctrine built around it was proven. So when Hellcat specifications arrived showing an aircraft weighing twice the Zero, with armor plate and self-sealing tanks and bulletproof glass, the rational interpretation was that the Americans had learned nothing. The specifications looked like a step backward. What Japanese analysts could not see in those numbers was that the Hellcat's designers had studied the Zero's doctrine carefully and had built an aircraft specifically engineered to make that doctrine irrelevant. The Hellcat's specifications read as a direct inversion of everything the Zero represented. Where the Zero carried no pilot armor, the Hellcat carried 212 pounds of plate. Where the Zero had unprotected fuel tanks, the Hellcat had self-sealing cells holding 250 gallons. Bulletproof glass, reinforced oil systems, 2,400 rounds of ammunition across 6 Browning M2 machine guns. Every element the Japanese had stripped out in the name of performance, the Hellcat's designers had put back in, deliberately, and for specific tactical reasons. The engine behind all of this was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, producing 2,000 horsepower. The Zero's Nakajima Sake produced 1,130. That 870 horsepower advantage translated directly into a climb rate of 3,500 feet per minute, sufficient to take a 12,000-pound aircraft vertical and keep it there. This matters because the entire Hellcat design logic depended on it. The wing loading tells the story plainly. At 36.5 pounds per square foot, the Hellcat could never outturn the Zero. Its turning radius exceeded 900 feet against the Zero's 612. Boeing engineers knew this before the first prototype flew. The Hellcat was not designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed so that the question would never come up. The combat doctrine the Hellcat was built around is called energy fighting. Altitude and speed are converted to kinetic energy in slashing, high-speed attacks. The Hellcat pilot climbs, dives on the target, fires, and climbs again before the Zero pilot can react. The geometry of this approach means the Zero's superior turn rate is simply never engaged. A Hellcat pilot who entered a turning fight had made a tactical error. The aircraft was not designed for that fight, and its pilots were trained never to accept it. Now, the K-14 computing gun sight removed one more variable from the equation. Deflection shooting, calculating where to aim when a target is crossing your path, is one of the most difficult skills in aerial gunnery. The K-14 calculated it automatically, accounting for airspeed, target angle, and range. This effectively transferred one of the highest skill elements of air combat from the pilot to the instrument. But the most decisive technical asymmetry in the archival record is one that rarely appears in general accounts. BU-Air stress testing confirmed the Hellcat's airframe at 13G. The Zero's structure began to show failure at the high-speed dives the Hellcat treated as routine. More specifically, above 300 miles per hour, the Zero's control surfaces loaded up under aerodynamic pressure to the point where pilot input produced diminishing results. At 400 miles per hour, the ailerons were effectively frozen. A Zero pilot attempting to roll at that speed was working against a control column that had become nearly immovable. The Hellcat's heavier, stiffer control linkage remained fully responsive through its entire dive envelope. Where the Zero's high-speed performance degraded precisely at the moment when slashing attacks were executed, the Hellcat's controls held. This asymmetry, confirmed in BU-Air test data and later corroborated by Japanese post-war engineering assessments, meant that the Hellcat's preferred attack profile was also the profile at which the Zero was most vulnerable. The Japanese had designed an aircraft optimized for one specific kind of fight. The Americans had studied that fight carefully, identified its structural limits, and built a machine engineered to operate exactly where those limits collapsed. What that meant in practice became clear the moment the two aircraft made contact. The first documented encounter between Japanese pilots and the Hellcat occurred on September 30, 1943, over Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when 6 dark blue shapes climbed from the southeast. His after-action report records his first impression. Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. The silhouette was wrong. The fuselage was too wide. The aircraft looked, by every Japanese standard of fighter design, like something that should not have been there. Fukui engaged with standard doctrine. He rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight while he curved onto its tail. What happened instead is recorded precisely in his report. The Hellcat went vertical. The R2800 drove it upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui attempted to follow. His airspeed decayed as the Zero struggled against gravity. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat executed a hammerhead turn and dropped directly onto his tail. Fukui took 17 hits in 3 seconds. He survived by dropping into a spin. His wingman did not return. Neither did the aircraft they were escorting. The archival record is specific about what this engagement demonstrated. The Hellcat had not outturned the Zero. It had simply refused the turning fight entirely, used its power advantage to take the vertical, and attacked from a position the Zero's doctrine had never prepared its pilots to defend against. 5 days later, on October 5th, at Wake Island, 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group intercepted a Hellcat formation holding every positional advantage: altitude, surprise, and the sun behind them. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga recorded what followed in his diary. The Zeros dove. The Hellcats maintained formation, accelerating into a shallow dive that preserved their energy. When the Zeros exhausted ammunition in their passes, the Hellcats climbed to altitude where the Nakajima Sakai was producing roughly 900 horsepower against the R-2800's 1,650. 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. Shiga's diary entry: "They came down on us like hawks on sparrows. Their weight gave them speed we could not match." By November 1943, the tactical failure was formal enough to require a briefing. At Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Tanamizu addressed the assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group. Tanamizu had survived multiple Hellcat engagements, which made him unusual. His assessment, recorded in Japanese naval records, was direct. "Forget everything you know about air combat. The Americans have changed the rules." He explained what the action reports were showing. The Hellcat was not attempting to engage in the fight Japanese doctrine assumed. It was using radar-directed fighter control to arrive at altitude with positional advantage already established. Japanese pilots climbing through cloud cover were being intercepted with no visual warning. One pilot's account described it plainly: "We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark." The Formosa raids of October 1944 produced the clearest numerical evidence of what had shifted. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome committed over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots from homeland training squadrons. Japanese claims after the engagement reported 26 carriers and battleships sunk and 300 aircraft destroyed. When pilots returned and gun camera footage was analyzed, the actual figures were documented. American losses stood at 89 aircraft. Japanese losses were 329 aircraft, and nearly every experienced pilot committed to the operation. Lieutenant Sadaaki Akamatsu, one of the few veterans to survive Formosa, described it in his post-war memoirs. "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division. It was not combat. It was systematic extermination." The Formosa disaster removed the last significant pool of experienced Japanese naval aviators. What followed at the Marianas was not a contest between air forces. It was a collision between a functioning system and the remnants of one that had already collapsed. Operation A-Go was Japan's attempt to reverse everything the previous 8 months had demonstrated. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa committed 9 carriers and 450 aircraft to the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. The strategic logic was straightforward: a decisive engagement that would destroy American carrier power before the Pacific perimeter collapsed entirely. Opposing him was Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 956 aircraft, 450 of which were Hellcats. The first Japanese wave launched at 0830. 69 aircraft, fighter escort and strike package combined, heading for the American fleet. American radar picked them up at 150 miles out. This is where the archival record shows something worth examining carefully. The intercept that followed was not simply a matter of better aircraft meeting worse ones. It was a coordinated system executing a prepared solution. At the center of that system were the Fighter Direction Officers, FDOs, stationed in the combat information centers below each carrier's flight deck. These were not pilots. They were trained controllers who read radar returns, tracked the developing geometry in real time, and issued vectors over radio directly to Hellcat division leaders. As the Japanese formation climbed toward the fleet, the FDOs were already calculating intercept headings, assigning altitude blocks to specific divisions, and stacking Hellcat sections above the threat axis. The Hellcat pilots did not need to search for the enemy. They were told exactly where to be, at what altitude, and from which direction to approach. By the time the Japanese formation made visual contact, the geometry was already decided, not by the pilots in the cockpits, but by controllers with radar screens 50 miles away. Hellcat divisions were vectored to altitude with the sun behind them, approaching from the precise quadrant where Japanese lookout doctrine created blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, described what he saw. Hellcats stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, positioned above and ahead. His formation was at 18,000. Every positional variable favored the Americans before a single shot was fired. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, described what he saw. Hellcats stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, positioned above and ahead. His formation was at 18,000. Every positional variable favored the Americans before a single shot was fired. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Commander David McCampbell's after-action report from that engagement is precise in its language. He recorded the tactical sequence without elaboration. High side run, fire, zoom climb back to altitude, repeat. "The Zeros tried to turn with us," he wrote. "We simply refused." When a Zero attempted to follow a climbing Hellcat, its Nakajima Sakai was working against both gravity and its own power ceiling. The Hellcat, already at altitude, was simply waiting. McCampbell shot down 7 aircraft that day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 6. 3 more Japanese waves followed throughout the day. The results were consistent across all of them. By the time the accounting was completed, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft. American losses from all causes, including operational accidents and anti-aircraft fire, totaled 30 aircraft. Now, the kill ratio question deserves direct treatment here, because overclaiming was documented across Pacific Theater action reports on both sides. American pilots, like all fighter pilots in all wars, sometimes claimed aircraft that were damaged rather than destroyed, or claimed the same aircraft as multiple pilots. The archival record acknowledges this. But overclaiming does not alter the structural outcome. Japanese carrier aviation ceased to function as an operational force after June 19, 1944. That fact is not in dispute in any primary source, American or Japanese. Admiral Ozawa addressed this directly in his after-action report. His language is worth noting because it identifies something beyond the tactical result. He described what Task Force 58 had achieved as the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat, he wrote, was not an individual fighter, but a component in a coordinated system. Radar provided targeting data. Fighter direction officers translated that data into intercept vectors. Pilots executed within doctrine rather than improvising against it. The result was that Japanese pilot skill, whatever remained of it after Formosa, had no surface to work against. There was no opening in the geometry. The system had already closed it. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening described it as a turkey shoot. The phrase captured something real. The Japanese aircraft had not been outflown in the traditional sense. They had been processed. The Hellcat's design, its weight, its power, its structural limits, its radar integration, had converted what Japanese doctrine assumed would be an air battle into something closer to a logistics problem. The question the Marianas answered was not whether Japan could still fight. It was whether the system that produced the Hellcat could be stopped by anything Japan had left to deploy. The answer to that question begins not on a flight deck, but on a factory floor in Bethpage, New York. At peak production, Grumman's plant completed 1 Hellcat every 60 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. Over 30 months, that pace produced 12,275 aircraft. In all of 1944, Japan produced 5,100 fighters of every type combined. The production gap alone does not explain the kill ratio, but it explains why the kill ratio was sustainable. Every Hellcat lost could be replaced within a day's output. Every experienced pilot lost on the Japanese side represented years of training that the system could no longer reproduce. The engine tells the deeper story. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 contained 2,840 precision-machined components, each one interchangeable with the same part in any other R-2800 ever built. A field crew could pull a damaged engine and drop in a replacement in under 30 minutes. The aircraft was back in the air the same day. The Nakajima Sakai required hand-fitting of individual components. No two engines came off the line dimensionally identical. A replacement engine could ground an aircraft for days while mechanics filed tolerances by hand, working toward a fit that had never been standardized. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, addressed this directly in his post-war engineering assessment. The Americans had not simply built a better engine. They had built an engine that existed within a system, a supply chain, a maintenance doctrine, a logistics architecture that treated the aircraft as a replaceable component rather than a precision artifact. The pilot equation followed the same pattern, and it collapsed faster. Japan entered the war with a training standard of 700 flight hours before combat. That figure represented a genuine professional force. Pilots who had spent years developing gunnery, formation, and instrument skills to a level the early war record confirmed was exceptional. By early 1944, that standard had eroded to 300 hours. By 1945, kamikaze pilots were receiving between 40 and 50 hours total. Enough to take off and navigate to a target, not enough to survive contact with a trained opponent. American pilots arriving in theater maintained a consistent floor of 300 hours, including 50 hours on their specific aircraft type, thousands of practice rounds through live gunnery training, and full carrier qualification. The training pipeline did not compress under pressure. It held because the industrial system behind it held. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigura Naval Air Station, recorded the result in his final report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." One entry describes Ensign Yamamoto arriving at the front with 7 minutes of first combat time before he was lost. He had never fired his guns in flight. There was no ammunition allocated for that level of practice. Horikoshi's post-war conclusion places this in its clearest frame. "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. By late 1944, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi had reduced the problem to mathematics. A conventional Zero attack against a Hellcat screen carried a probability of success approaching 0. A kamikaze carried roughly 30%. The pilot died either way. This was not fanaticism driving the decision, it was arithmetic. The final acknowledgement that conventional air combat against the Hellcat was no longer viable. At Okinawa, Japan committed 1,900 kamikaze sorties. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties and claimed 2,351 victories against 249 losses. A 9.5-to-1 ratio, under the most desperate conditions Japan could produce. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, 87 claimed kills, Japan's ace of aces, died as a transport passenger, shot down by Hellcats from VF-14, without a fighter of his own. Saburo Sakai's final assessment was direct. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. The archival record is unambiguous. The Hellcat didn't win because it outflew the Zero. It won because it outsystemed it, in design, production, logistics, and doctrine. If you want to understand more engagements like this one, subscribe and watch the next video.